So, hello and welcome back to Frankenstein by the great Mary Shelley, where we are finally going to be getting into the actual meat of the story. We spent the first two nights going through all of the prefaces, which is kind of fun. I did enjoy reading about from both Mary and Percy Shelley, reading about the making of, basically. It's kind of a little behind the scenes glimpse into the mind of the author and the author's husband. So that was a lot of fun. And then the letters from the captain to his sister were also kind of nice, setting things up. And I mean, I'm pretty sure that we all know that this has got to be Victor Frankenstein that was plucked off the ice, but we aren't sure of that yet. So we are going to jump back in and we are going to be reading chapters 1 and 2 of Frankenstein, the Modern Prometheus by Mary Shelley. And yeah, I hope everybody is doing good. I hope that you are enjoying this holiday season. I've actually been having a lot of fun with this whole Vlogmas thing that I'm doing also in conjunction with reading in my channel. I don't know that I'm doing it right per se, but I'm having a lot of fun with it. But that is neither here nor there. Let us jump back in to Volume 1, Chapter 1 of Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I am by birth a Genevese, and my family is one of the most distinguished of that republic. My ancestors had been for many years counselors, and my father had filled several public situations with honor and reputation. He was respected by all who knew him for his integrity and his attention to public business. He passed his younger days perpetually occupied by the affairs of his country. A variety of circumstances had prevented his marrying early, and it was not until the decline of his life that he became a husband and the father of a family. As the circumstances of his marriage illustrate his character, I cannot refrain from relating them. One of his most intimate friends was a merchant who, from a flourishing state, fell through numerous mischances into poverty. This man, whose name was Beaufort, was of a proud and unbending disposition, and he could not bear to live in poverty and oblivion in the same country where he had once been distinguished for his rank and magnificence. Having paid his debts, therefore, in the most honorable manner, he retreated with his daughter to the town of Lucerne, where he lived unknown and in wretchedness. My father loved Beaufort with the truest friendship and was deeply grieved by his retreat during these unfortunate circumstances. He bitterly deplored the false pride which led his friend to a conduct so little worthy of the affection that united them. He lost no time in endeavoring to seek him out with the hope of persuading him to begin the world again through his credit and assistance. Beaufort had taken effectual measures to conceal himself, and it was 10 months before my father discovered his abode. Overjoyed at this discovery, he hastened to the house, which was situated on a mean street near the Ruesse. But when he entered, misery and despair alone welcomed him. Beaufort had saved but a very small sum of money from the wreck of his fortunes. It was sufficient to provide him with sustenance for some months, and in the meantime he hoped to procure some respectable employment in a merchant's home. The interval was, consequently, spent in inaction. His grief only became more deep and ranking when he had leisure for reflection, and at length it took so fast a hold on his mind that at the end of 3 months he lay on a bed of sickness, incapable of any exertion. His daughter attended him with the greatest tenderness, but She saw with despair that their little fund was rapidly decreasing and that there was no other prospect of support. But Caroline Beaufort possessed a mind of an uncommon mold, and her courage rose to support her in that adversity. She procured plain work. She plaited straw, and by various means contrived to earn a pittance, scarcely sufficient to support life. Several months passed in this manner. Her father grew worse. Her time was more entirely occupied in attending him. Her means of subsistence decreased, and in the 10th month her father died in her arms, leaving her an orphan and a beggar. This last blow overcame her, and she knelt by Beaufort's coffin, weeping bitterly, when my father entered the chamber. He came like a protecting spirit to the poor girl, who committed herself to his care, and after the interment of his friend, he conducted her to Geneva and placed her under the protection of a relation. 2 years after this, Caroline became his wife. There was a considerable difference between the ages of my parents, but this circumstance seemed to unite them only closer in bonds of devoted affection. There was a sense of justice in my father's upright mind, which rendered it necessary that he should approve highly to love strongly. Perhaps during former years he had suffered from the late discovered unworthiness of one beloved, and so he was disposed to set a greater value on tried worthiness. There was a show of gratitude and worship in his attachment to my mother, differing wholly from the doting fondness of age, for it was inspired by reverence for her virtues and a desire to be the means of, in some degree, recompensing her for the sorrows she had endured. But it gave inexpressible grace to his behavior towards her. Everything was made to yield to her wishes and her convenience. He strove to shelter her as a fair exotic is sheltered by the gardener from every rough wind, and to surround her with all that could excite pleasurable emotion in her soft and benevolent mind. Her health, and even the tranquility of her spirit, had been shaken by what she had gone through. During the 2 years that had elapsed previous to the marriage, my father had gradually relinquished all of his public functions, and immediately after their union they sought the pleasant climate of Italy, and the change of scene and interest attended on a tour through that land of wonders as a restorative for her weakened frame. From Italy, they visited Germany and France. I, their eldest child, was born in Naples, and as an infant accompanied them on their rambles. I remained for several years their only child. Much as they were attached to each other, they seemed to draw inexhaustible stores of affection from a very mine of love, and bestowed it upon me. My mother's tender caresses and my father's smiles of benevolent pleasure while regarding me are my very first recollections. I was their plaything and their idol, and, even better, their child, the innocent and helpless creature bestowed on them by heaven, whom to bring up to good, and whose future lot was in their hands to direct to happiness or misery according as they fulfilled their duty towards me. With this deep consciousness of what they owed towards the being in which they had given life, it added to their active spirit of tenderness that animated both of them. It may be imagined that well during every hour of my infant life I received a lesson of patience, charity, and self-control. I was so guided by the silken cord that all seemed but one long train of enjoyment to me. For a long time I was their only care. My mother had much desire to have a daughter, but I continued as their single offspring. When I was about 5 years old, while making an excursion beyond the frontiers of Italy, they passed a week on the shores of the Lake of Como. Their benevolent disposition often made them enter the cottages of the poor. This, to my mother, was more than a duty, it was a necessity, a passion. Remembering what she had suffered and how she had been relieved, for her to act, in her turn, the guardian angel to the afflicted. During one of their walks, a poor cot in the foldings of a veil attracted their notice as being singularly run down. Well, the number of half-clothed children that were gathered around it spoke of poverty in its worst form. One day, when my father had gone by himself to Milan, my mother, accompanied by me, visited this abode. She found a peasant and his wife, hard-working, bent down by care and labor, distributing a scanty meal to 5 hungry babes. Above these, there was one which attracted my mother far above all the rest. She appeared of a different stock. The 4 others were dark-eyed, hardy little vagrants, but this child was thin and very fair. Her hair was the brightest living gold, and despite the poverty of her clothing, seemed to set a crowd of distinction above her head. Her brow was clear and ample, her blue eyes cloudless, and her lips and the molding of her face so expressive of sensibility and sweetness that none could behold her without looking on her as of a distinct species, a being heaven sent, bearing a celestial stamp on all of her features. The peasant woman, perceiving that my mother fixed eyes of wonder and admiration on this lovely girl, eagerly communicated her history. She was not the woman's child, but the daughter of a Milanese nobleman. Her mother was a German and had died on giving her birth. The infant had been placed with these good people to nurse. They were better off then. They had not been very long married, and their eldest had just been born. The father of their charge was one of those Italians nursed in the memory of the antique glory of Italy, one among the Schiavoni Ogar Fermenti, who exerted himself to obtain the liberty of his country. He became a victim of his country's weakness. Whether he had died or still lingered in the dungeons of Austria was unknown. His property had been confiscated, and his child had become an orphan and a beggar. She continued with her foster parents and bloomed in their rude abode, fairer than a garden rose amongst dark-leaved brambles. When my father returned from Milan, he found, playing with me in the hall of our villa, a child fairer than a pictured cherub, a creature who seemed to shed radiance from her looks and whose form and motions were lighter than the chamois of the hills. The apparition was soon explained. With his permission, my mother prevailed on her rustic guardians to yield their charge to her. They were fond of the sweet orphan. Her presence had seemed a blessing to them, but it would be unfair to keep her in poverty and want when Providence afforded her such powerful protection. They had consulted their village priest, and the result was that Elizabeth Lavenza became the intimate of my parents' house, my more than sister, the beautiful and adored companion of all my occupations and my pleasures. Everyone loved Elizabeth. The passionate and most reverential attachment with all which regarded her was when I shared it. My pride. She was my delight. On the evening previous to her being brought to my home, my mother had said playfully, "I have a pretty present for my Victor, and tomorrow he shall have it. And when, on the morrow, she presented Elizabeth to me as her promised gift, I, with childish seriousness, interpreted her words literally, and I looked upon Elizabeth as mine, mine to protect, love, and cherish. All praise bestowed on her I received and made a possession of my own. We called each other familiarly by the name of cousin. No word, no expression could boldly forth the kind of relation in which she stood to me, my more than sister, since, till death, she was to be mine and mine only. And that is the end of chapter 1. Chapter 2. We were brought up together. There was not quite a year difference in our ages. I need not say that we were strangers to any species of disunion or dispute. Harmony was the soul of our companionship, and the diversity and contrast that subsisted in our characters drew us closer together. Elizabeth was of a calmer and more concentrated disposition, but with all my ardor, I was capable of more intense application and was more deeply smitten by the thirst for knowledge. She busied herself with following the aerial creations of the poets, and in the majestic and wondrous scenes that surrounded our Swiss home, the sublime shapes of the mountains, the changes of the seasons, tempest and calm, the silence of winter, and the life and turbulence of our alpine summers, she found ample scope for admiration and delight. While my companion contemplated with a serious and satisfied spirit the magnificent appearances of things, I delighted in investigating their causes. The world was to me a secret which I desired to divine. Curiosity, earnest research to learn the hidden laws of nature, gladness that was akin to rapture as they were unfolded to me, are amongst the earliest sensations I remember. On the birth of another son, my junior by 7 years, my parents gave up entirely their wandering life and fixed themselves in their native country. We possessed a house in Geneva and a campagne on Belle Rive, the eastern shore of the lake, at a distance of rather more than a league from the city. We resided principally in the latter, and the lives of my parents were passed in considerable seclusion. It was my temper to avoid a crowd and to attach myself fervently to but a few. I was indifferent, therefore, to my schoolfellows in general, but I united myself in the bonds of closest friendship to one among them. Henry Clerval was the son of a merchant of Geneva. He was a boy of singular talent and fancy. He loved enterprise, hardship, and even danger for its own sake. He was deeply read in books of chivalry and romance. He composed heroic songs and began to write many a tale of enchantment and knightly adventure. He tried to make us act plays and enter into masquerades in which the characters were drawn from the heroes of Roncesvalles and of the Round Table of King Arthur, and the chivalrous train who shed their blood to redeem the Holy Sepulchre from the hand of the infidel. No human being could have passed a happier childhood than myself. My parents were possessed by the very spirit of kindness and indulgence. We felt that they were not the tyrants to rule our lot according to caprice, but the agent and creators of all the delights we enjoyed. When I mingled with other families, I distinctly discerned how peculiarly fortunate my group was, and gratitude assisted the development of filial love. My temper was sometimes violent, and my passions vehement, but by some law in my temperature, they were turned not to childish pursuits, but to a desire to learn, and not to learn all things indiscriminately. I confess that neither the structure of language, or the code of governments, or the politics of various states possessed any attraction for me. It was the secrets of heaven and earth that I desired to learn. And whether it was the outward substance of things, or the inner spirit of nature and the mysterious soul of man that occupied me, still my inquiries were directed to the metaphysical, or in its highest sense, the physical secrets of the world. Meanwhile, Clerval occupied himself, so to speak, with the moral relations to things. The busy stage of life, the virtues of heroes, and the actions of men were his theme, and his hope and dream was to become one among whose names are recorded in story as the gallant and adventurous benefactors of our species. The saintly soul of Elizabeth shone like a shrine-dedicated lamp in our peaceful home. Her sympathy was ours, her smile, her soft voice, the sweet glance of her celestial eyes were ever there to bless and animate us. She was the living spirit of love to soften and attract. I might have become sullen in my study, rough through the ardor of my nature, but that she was there to subdue me to a semblance of her own gentle nature. And Clerval, could aught ill entrench on the noble spirit of Clerval? Yet he might not have been so perfectly humane, so thoughtful in his generosity, so full of kindness and tenderness amidst his passion for adventurous exploits, had she not unfolded to him the real loveliness of beneficence, and made the doing good the end and aim of his ambitions. I feel exquisite pleasure in dwelling on the recollections of childhood, before misfortune had tainted my mind and changed its bright visions of extensive usefulness into gloomy and narrow recollections upon self. Besides, in drawing the picture of my early days, I also record those events which led, step by step, to my aftertale of misery. For when I would account to myself for the birth of that passion which afterwards ruled my destiny, I find it arising like a mountain river from ignoble and almost forgotten sources, but swelling as it proceeded to become the torrent which in its course has swept away all of my hope and joy. Natural philosophy is the genius that has relegated my fate. I desire, therefore, in this narration to state the facts which led to my predilection for that science. When I was 13 years of age, we all went on a party of pleasure to the baths near Thonlon. The inclemency of the weather obliged us to remain a day confined to the inn. In this house, I chanced to find a volume of the Works of Cornelius Agrippa. I opened it with apathy. The theory which he attempts to demonstrate and the wonderful facts which he relates soon changed this to enthusiasm. A new light seemed to dawn upon my mind, and bounding with joy, I communicated my discovery to my father. My father looked carelessly at the title page of my book and said, "Ah, Cornelius Agrippa. My dear Victor, do not waste your time upon this. It is sad trash." If, instead of this remark, my father had taken the pains to explain to me that the principles of Agrippa had been entirely exploded, and that a modern system of science had been introduced which presented much greater powers than the ancient, because the powers of the latter were chimerical, While those of the former were real and practical, under such circumstances, I should certainly have thrown Agrippa aside and have contented my imagination, warmed as it was, by returning with greater ardor to my previous studies. It is even possible that the train of my ideas would never have received the fatal impulse which has led to my ruin. But the cursory glance that my father had taken of my volume by no means assured me that he was acquainted with its contents, and I continued to read with greatest avidity. When I returned home, my first care was to procure the whole of the works of this author, and afterward of Paracelsus and Albertus Magnus. I read and studied the wild fancies of these writers with delight. They appeared to me treasures known to few besides myself. I've described myself as always having been imbued with a fervent longing to penetrate the secrets of nature. In spite of the intense labor and the wonderful discoveries of modern philosophers, I always came from my studies discontented and unsatisfied. Sir Isaac Newton is said to have avowed that he felt like a child picking up shells beside the great and unexplored ocean of truth. Those of his successors in each branch of natural philosophy with whom I was acquainted appeared even to my boy's apprehensions as tyros engaged in the same pursuit. The untaught peasant beheld the elements around him and was acquainted with their practical uses. The most learned philosopher knew little more. He had partially unveiled the face of nature, but her immortal lineaments were still a wonder and mystery. He might dissect, atomize, and give names, but not speak of a final cause. Causes in their secondary and tertiary grades were entirely unknown to him. I had gazed upon fortifications and impediments that seemed to keep humans from entering the citadel of nature, and, rashly and ignorant, I had repined. But here were books, and here were men who had penetrated deeper and knew more. I took their word for all they averred, and I became their disciple. It may appear strange that such should arise in the 18th century, but while I followed the routine of education in the schools of Geneva, I was, to a great degree, self-taught with regard to my favorite studies. My father was not scientific, and I was left to struggle with a child's blindness, aided by a student's thirst for knowledge. Under the guidance of my new teachers, I entered with the greatest diligence into the search of the philosopher's stone and elixir of life, but the latter soon obtained my undivided attention. Wealth was an inferior object, but what glory would attend the discovery if I could banish disease from the human frame and render man invulnerable to anything but a violent death? Nor were these my only visions. The raising of ghosts or devils was a promise liberally accorded by my favorite authors. The fulfillment of this I most eagerly sought, and if my inclinations were always unsuccessful, I attributed the failure rather to my inexperience and mistakes than to a want of skill or fidelity on my instructors. And thus, for a time, I was occupied by exploded systems mingling like an unadept, a thousand contradictory theories, and I was floundering desperately in a very slough of multi-familiar knowledge, guided by an ardent imagination and childish reasoning, until an accident again changed the current of my ideas. When I was about 15 years old, we had retired to our house near Bellerive when we witnessed a most violent and terrible thunderstorm. It advanced from behind the mountains of Jura, and the thunder burst at once with a frightful loudness from various quarters of the heavens. I remained while the storm lasted, watching its progress with curiosity and delight. As I stood at the door, on a sudden, I beheld a stream of fire issue from an old and beautiful oak which stood about 20 yards from our house. And so soon as the dazzling light vanished, the oak had disappeared and nothing remained but a blasted stump. When we visited it the next morning, we found the tree shattered in a singular manner. It was not splintered by the shock, but entirely reduced to thin ribbons of wood. I had never beheld anything so utterly destroyed. Before this, I was not unacquainted with the most obvious laws of electricity. On this occasion, a man of great research in natural philosophy was with us, and excited by this catastrophe, he entered on an explanation of a theory which he had formed on the subject of electricity and galvanism, which was at once new and astonishing to me. Everything he said threw greatly into shade Cornelius Agrippa, Albertus Magnus, and Paracelsus, the lords of my imagination. But by some fatality, the overthrow of these men disinclined me to pursue my accustomed studies. It seemed to me as if nothing would or could ever be known. All that had so long engaged my attention suddenly grew despicable. By one of those caprices of the mind which we are perhaps most subject to in early youth, I all at once gave up my former occupation, set down natural history and all of its progeny as a deformed creation, and entertained a greatest disdain for the would-be science, which could never even step within the threshold of real knowledge. In this mood of mind, I betook myself to mathematics and the branches of study appertaining to that science, as they were built upon secure foundations and therefore worthy of my consideration. Thus strangely are our souls constructed, and by such slight ligaments are we bound to prosperity or ruin. When I look back, it seems to me as if this almost miraculous change of inclination and will was the immediate suggestion of the guardian angel of my life, the last effort made by the spirit of preservation to avert the storm that was even then hanging in the stars and ready to envelop me. Her victory was announced by an unusually tranquil and gladness of the soul which followed the relinquishing of my ancient and latterly tormented studies. It was thus that I was to be taught to associate evil with their prosecution and happiness with their disregard. It was a strong effort on the spirit of good, but it was ineffectual. Destiny was too potent, and her immutable laws had decreed my utter, terrible destruction. And that is the end of chapter 2 and the end of our reading for tonight. So, Victor Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein, as a child was, well, not even child, as a teen, was definitely into the entire, Philosopher's Stone thing. Now I'm feeling Full Metal Alchemist vibes. It's funny. I was talking with my neighbor a couple days ago, and we were actually talking about Frankenstein, and and how it had been inspired during the year without a summer, and how, it had also partially been inspired by the new discoveries in electricity and things like that. And when you stop and think about it, it's absolutely insane how much has changed just in what, like 250 years or so since this book was written. Just, I mean, we've gone from candles to Christmas lights. It's bananas. Bananas? Yeah, bananas, not bananas. And then I was thinking about how insane it is also that we've gone from TV to like basically computers that outperform the very first computers, obviously, but we're holding them in our pockets. And I've gotten to witness that. And it seems so commonplace now, the smartphones, computers, things like that. But if you would have told kid me about a smartphone, I would have thought you were insane. I mean, if you would have told me when I was like 5 years old that I would not go anywhere without my computer in my pocket, I would have said that you were watching way too much Star Trek. And now here we are. The more things change, the more things stay the same. Anyway, I'm enjoying this story quite a bit so far. And we haven't even gotten to the making of the creature, so that's kind of cool. Anyway, thank you so much. Please do leave me a thumbs up if you don't mind. It does always make me smile, and I will see you tomorrow.